Hi, Sarah.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
Not bad.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show. You are Sarah Posner. You do pronounce it Posner, right?
Yes.
Glad to hear that. And you are known to many in our audience from past appearances and to many in the world from the writing you do. You've written for just about everywhere, New York Times, Washington Post, Atlantic, and so on, Guardian. You cover, well, politics, but often things related to religion.
Right.
Wrote a book called God's Prophets, Profits, although there may have been a little bit of a double entendre there.
Absolutely.
And we're going to talk about Trump, the early days of the administration, and a lot of things. I certainly want to get to this question of, like, does he believe the untrue things he says, or, you know, and is he, like, crazy or crazy like a fox or what? All of these things are interrelated, and I want to get to those. But I thought maybe, and some other things that I think you want to talk about, but I wanted to start off talking about the march, the Women's March. Did you go?
I did not, but I watched what was unfolding from afar. I happened to be in a town where there was no march.
Oh, that's sad. Where was that? I didn't know there was such a town.
Yes. But it was a previous long-standing commitment, and so that's why I was there instead of in Washington covering the march, which I would have liked to have done. But it was interesting actually to watch everything unfold on the internet, and getting information via Twitter and news coverage, and even from people sending me photos and observations from people I knew who were at the marches. And I think it was extraordinary, just the sheer number of people who came to Washington and the sheer number of people who showed up in places you might not have ever imagined. Nashville, Indianapolis, Anchorage, Alaska.
Well, Trenton, New Jersey isn't exactly a cosmopolitan, major hub on the business class circuit, but that's where my wife and one of my daughters went.
Right. And I think that it's important to point out that there were many, many marches or rallies that were not in coastal cities, that were in the middle of the country. Like I said, places like Indianapolis, where Mike Pence is from, and places like Nashville, like I said, Cincinnati, Chillicothe, Ohio, which is actually someplace I've been. It's a pretty small town. There was an article in the New York Times a few weeks ago investigating the opioid epidemic. Oh. And I was just kind of trolling around local news coverage just to see in what states were these rallies and marches taking place. And I happened upon news coverage of the one in Chillicothe. And I thought it was pretty remarkable because Chillicothe is not the kind of place where you'd expect women to show up.
To be honest, the name is new to me.
Yes.
I've been to Ohio. Oh, wait, this is in Indiana or?
No, it's in Ohio.
It's in Ohio. Okay.
It's probably, I'm probably gonna get the distance wrong, but it's south of Columbus, probably an hour or maybe about that.
Yeah, I'm thinking, it sounded like maybe 3 million nationwide was not a crazy estimate for the total. Right. And would that be the biggest in American history? Or were there things back during Vietnam that rivaled that? I guess we don't know. But
yeah, I think that just because of the internet, it enabled us to make those kinds of counts in a way that maybe we couldn't have in the 1960s.
Yeah, maybe not. So, like, one question people are asking is, where do we go from here? Can this momentum be sustained, and how? David Brooks in this column that you saw said we got it wrong from the get-go, that this march, the issues it focused on, leave us ill-prepared to launch, a major anti-Trump counter-initiative.
Well, I think he misapprehends what the energy behind it is.
He seemed to be hoping it would be his own ideological energy.
Well, there was the line about capitalism with a biblical morality underlying it. I think that if there was
and there was another one where he said, "Look, you guys got to understand, these are the things that are under threat: capitalism, globalization." America as leader of the world, and these are things like David. I think these are maybe rank higher. You're right. Not everyone out there is most concerned about the fate of capitalism per se, right, or America's role in the world. They're just different people. They're not you.
Right. And I think that he's thinking of it as a pundit who writes a twice weekly column for the New York Times. And he's thinking about this on this global scale, and he's looking at it from the standpoint of watching these authoritarian populist movements rise in Europe and Russia and now here, and thinking this is what we need to combat. But how do you combat that? Do you combat that by talking about capitalism and globalization, or do you combat that by energizing people at the grassroots to confront Trumpism, which clearly people around the world wanted to confront? There were people marching in cities all over the world. And what is the way to confront Trumpism? I don't think that most Americans are fretting about these sort of bigger theoretical issues. They're not theoretical, but like the idea of like, what should our economic philosophy, guiding economic philosophy be? It's really more, and I think that this is a overarching theme that I would think that somebody like Brooks would be concerned about. I think the people who went to the march were primarily driven by their concerns about Trump's assault on the Constitution. And if you look at it from the standpoint of they're talking about women's rights and the rights of people of color and the rights of the disabled. And these are all issues that come from our Constitution, our free press, the rights of free speech and assembly. These are things that I think are at the heart of what drives the marchers. But they may be energizing people by talking about defunding Planned Parenthood, or banning abortion, or possible reversals on LGBT rights, or things like that, or the environment, or many of the other issues that they're concerned about. But I think at its core, they're driven by a desire to protect the constitutional republic as we've known it, and stop Trump from shredding it. And what's kind of amazing is that he's shredding it in ways that should concern conservatives too, but many conservatives are nonetheless focused on the dirty hippies in their mind who showed up for the marches.
Brooks mentioned the Constitution, and I thought that signified partial overlap with the concerns of people to the left of him. I mean, I think they're all concerned about civil liberties, probably. I think on an issue like abortion, they come out on different sides. In his conception, I mean, the average conservative conception of defending the Constitution is to reverse Roe, and but there is a partial overlap there. Yeah. I also thought the Brooks column was kind of conflating protest as a vehicle with various other vehicles that will have to come into play over the next 4 years if you don't want Trump to be reelected, including, political parties and so on. I mean, he acted as if the protest movement should be subordinate to, like, some kind of, more literally partisan movement. And I think protests are just kind of sui generis, and you have to kind of take the energy where you can find it to some extent. There's not going to be like a platform, an overarching, truly broad platform of the kind that emerges from a political convention that drives a protest movement. That's just not the way it happens. Right.
And I think I've heard conservatives criticize the marches for having an unclear message or a muddled message, or trying to address so many issues that the message got muddled. And I just do not really see that, because I think that the marches were all energized by a single thing, and that is Trump. Right. And you can't dispute that. Right. And so I think that they played an important role for the people who showed up at them, the many people who showed up for them, and I think even people who watched them from afar. I mean, there were people who couldn't physically get to them, but perhaps watched it on TV or the internet and watched it unfold. And I think that it plays an important role in making people realize the power of people organizing with one another. I think we heard a lot about populism over the course of the campaign, often with regard to Bernie Sanders, but also with regard to Trump. And the thing that Trump succeeded, I think, at doing was creating this atmosphere in which he portrayed himself as the great populist savior who had these huge rallies. And I think that it was important to the people who marched to go out and say, look, you know, you may say that you had these huge rallies and that you're the man of the people, but you're not. You don't represent our interests. In fact, you're a threat to our interests. I think that was the overarching message of the marches. And I think that a lot of people are coming away from them with a resolve to go back to home and organize and be in touch with their elected members of Congress and going to town halls and so on, just like Tea Partiers did in 2009 and 2010, and to convince elected officials that Trump is not, you know, that there's other points of view, and that submitting to Trump, which is what I think Trump wants, is not what people want.
Mm-hmm. So when people say, well, but where do we go from here? How do you harness this momentum? It sounds like you're not thinking of it so much in terms of how do you sustain demonstrations per se, marches per se.
Right.
That's not the idea from your point of view. I mean, I think that's an interesting question, but you're thinking this has imparted an energy that's already playing itself out in other realms.
Well, I think that, you know, there was that document that went around that was written by the former Hill staffers right after Trump got elected, which kind of took the Tea Party model and tried to spin it out to progressives and say, look, this is what the Tea Party did. They showed up at town halls that their member of Congress had, and they shook their fists and said that they hated Obamacare and they wanted Obamacare repealed and so on and so forth. And Congress responded. And so this document was basically saying, take a page from that book. So if you're a member of Congress, particularly if you live in a red state and you're not a Republican, go to these town halls that they have. And you saw this play out in the weekend, I think, before the march, where there was a congressman in Colorado, I think, who had a whole bunch of people show up at his event who were urging him not to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And it got so, I think, intense for him that he snuck out a back door. So,
that's a good sign.
Profiles and courage. But so I think that if people remain energized to do those kinds of things, then I think it really could be a movement. I think that street demonstrations are an important facet of political expression. But I think it has to be accompanied with actual political action, and that also includes training people to run for office. I mean, this is something that the right has done very successfully for many decades, is to train people to run for school board and city council and then state legislature and work your way up. I mean, if you think about somebody like Michelle Bachmann, she got her political career started by running for school board in Stillwater, Minnesota. And so I think for progressives to have a sustainable movement, that's the sort of thing that they have to start thinking about on a systematic scale, like conservatives have done for so many years.
Yeah, I think part of the current moment, what's odd about it, is that there's so many Republicans, at least among elites, like David Brooks, who do not like this Republican president.
Yes,
and he's kind of hoping that like this energy can merge with his own ideological energy, and that may be challenging. In terms of the demonstrations, I was trying to, I was thinking in terms of sustaining actual in the street stuff. One challenge is this was so vast that almost anything looks like a decline in momentum, anything else you would stage. And I was wondering if they could do things just in successive cities, like, and I was wondering if there's like a single issue that you could get a lot of people to rally around, like the demand. I mean, one thing that I think is good is to have demands, like to have goals, to have things you want to happen now. I mean, some of these legislative goals are admittedly distant, and they're not going to happen with this president and this Congress. But if there are things that you can demand happen now, then people can rally around them. And this is, of course, what Occupy Wall Street lacked, is specific demands and goals. And I was thinking maybe financial transparency, release your income taxes, as you said you would, and and show who you owe money to, who are your co-investors, the full balance sheet. And I was thinking, like, if every month you could just get one city, like every month, is this crazy? Like this one issue, this would just keep it in the news. One day a month, one city, you could turn out a good crowd in a lot of cities. It wouldn't be mind blowing, but look, if over 10,000 people protest in a city, that's national news.
Right.
And you could do that. And
I think that the tax returns is a very potent demand, because I think already we've seen public opinion polling at something like 60-70% of Americans. Maybe it's not that high, but it was definitely a majority think that Trump should release his tax returns. And I've already seen some talk about having an April 15th, or I guess this year it's April 18th, but whatever tax day is, having protests, multi-city protests on that day to demand the release of his tax returns. But there's no reason why that couldn't happen, I imagine, before that. And it seems like, I think what's appealing about it is it's kind of nonpartisan. It's about transparency and ethics and clean government. And also I think that Trump, it would be interesting to see Trump's reaction to it.
It's always interesting to see his reaction to things. And the logic is just ironclad. I mean, if you are not going to divest yourself of your assets, as would be the most straightforward way to end the conflict of interest issues, transparency is so obviously the next best thing. And it's totally within his power to do. And he has no good excuse.
I think it's obvious he doesn't want to.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of speculation about why that is. Some people think that the returns would show entanglements with foreign governments or debt or not wealth less than what...
Oh, I'm sure much less. But he says 10 billion, and he always exaggerates by a factor of roughly 5. So I'm guessing 2 billion. But,
which is nothing to sneeze at. No,
it's nothing to sneeze at, but it would be embarrassing for him.
Yes.
The other thing I'd say in terms of demonstrations is, today he came out with a couple of not surprising things on environmental and oil issues. He's going to resurrect the Keystone Pipeline, and then he's also pro Dakota. What's the term? Dakota Access. And it seems to me the Dakota thing could become a real flashpoint with demonstrators. It's going to be, it was when Obama was president. It was a substantial and persistent demonstration, even with Obama. It seems to me it's going to be a lot easier to drum up energy. And, I'm almost worried. I can imagine people getting seriously hurt or killed, ultimately. I don't want to get too alarmist, but I can envision a standoff, and Trump, I just don't think he can stand to be defeated. I think he'd want to, ultimately clear the people away, and that's when it gets ugly.
Well, I do think it's extremely worrying, his views of law enforcement. And I think that is something that we all should be worried about, that he would have some kind of crackdown on demonstrations, even under some kind of pretext. Because he does like to talk about law and order and policing and, criticizing people who criticize the police. And that is, you're right. It's extremely worrying. I think we're only seeing the tip of what's happening in terms of demonstrations and what the Trump reaction to them is going to be. Right now, all we've seen is a big tantrum about the comparison of the numbers who came out for the march versus his inaugural. But you're right. I think we haven't wanted to imagine what it could look like.
Yeah. So, speaking of that and his reaction to that. So, that was, of course, a big dust-up. He, involving Sean Spicer, his press secretary, and I guess most people are familiar with it. Spicer's very first appearance before the press corps under this administration was to come out and just give them a lecture and insist that Trump's inauguration crowd had actually been bigger than Obama's. And he was widely ridiculed for that. Then he had a second, his first actual appearance before the press answering questions I thought he actually did a fairly good job of salvaging something or other. Because they had, if you paid close attention on the first day when he said this was the biggest turnout for an inauguration, period, then he went on to say kind of something about, counting everyone everywhere or something. And it turned out...
He tried to fudge it, like everyone who had live streamed it on the internet.
Exactly, and that turned out to be his kind of ace in the hole. And I thought his encounter with Jonathan Karl of CNN went well from his point of view, I thought. But anyway, back to the psychology behind this and Trump's... there are different theories as to what's going on. Some people just thought, well, this is Trump admitting how petulant and insecure he is by making a huge deal of this and blowing his credibility by getting his press secretary to defend the indefensible. And then there were some people who were like, no, crazy like a fox. This is masterful distraction from coverage of the Women's March, and he's declaring war on the press. He wants to establish in the minds of his followers they cannot trust anything the press does. And of course, a journalist had done him a huge favor, the Pool reporter, by misreporting on Twitter that he had removed the Martin Luther King bust from the Oval Office and then having to apologize for it. And that's the kind of thing that's very powerful. I mean, his followers will be talking about that for the next 4 years. I mean, that will become like iconic. And that's why, reporters have to be careful. That is major ammunition. And so anyway, there is the view that actually, if you look at what he wants to do, immunize his base against all mainstream media reporting, distract coverage from the Women's March, it all makes sense. What, do you subscribe to one of these theories or the other, crazy or crazy like a fox?
Well, I think that what happened subsequently on the second official press briefing on the Tuesday after the inaugural was more telling of what his strategy is. And that was where Sean Spicer came out and, repeated the lie that Trump perpetuated the day before to members of Congress, where he basically took a victory lap and said that he won, but he lost. He won the election, but he lost the popular vote because somewhere between 3 and 5 million votes were cast illegally for Hillary. Now, there was different reporting on that. Like one report I read said that the people in the room interpreted it as he said that about illegal immigrants had voted for Hillary, and then some people interpreted it as he was talking about voter fraud. 3 to 5 million fraudulently cast ballots for Hillary. And today, Spicer came out and doubled down on that and said that there were studies. There are no studies.
Well, Spicer this time did not embrace it himself. He kept saying, yes, that is the president's belief,
yes.
And he's seen studies and research. The only study he cited was something that happened in the 2008 election, and unless I'm doing the math wrong, that's not the election where Trump was elected. I mean, that was some estimate by somebody on how many ballots nationwide had been something or other. But
but I think you have to look at it not. I think a lot of people are looking at it as, oh, this is Trump's fragile ego. Can't take that he lost the popular vote, so has to come up with some reason why he did lose the popular vote. But I think you have to look at it through the prism of policy. Otherwise, you're just going to get wrapped up in this, armchair psychology of Trump, which gets you nowhere, right? It doesn't accomplish anything in terms of accountability or transparency or holding the Trump administration accountable. So if you look at it through the prism of, say, the fact that he and his allies fretted and perpetuated conspiracy theories about voter fraud throughout the campaign, and that his nominee to be Attorney General has celebrated the gutting of the Voting Rights Act as a U.S. attorney in where's he from? Alabama. Prosecuted non-existent voter fraud case.
Right. Has
indicated that he also thinks that voter fraud is widespread. I think you have to look at it as a setup for what the Trump Justice Department would do with regard to voting rights. So I think once you step back from, oh, here's Trump being Trump again, he's lying, he's doing this, that, or the other thing. You have to look at it. I think he's playing a longer game, and he's trying to distract everybody playing the short game. They're playing the 24-hour news cycle game, but he's playing a longer game, and his longer game is to convince not only his base, but perhaps other people, so that he could potentially have a majority of Americans agreeing with him for, crackdowns on, suppression of voting, either, voter ID requirements or purging voter rolls, or any of the things that have been tried by conservatives who have sought to, gut the Voting Rights Act and suppress the vote. And I think if you look at it from that perspective, it makes more sense in a way. I mean, and it helps the press and the public keep their eye on the ball. Why is he doing that? Think about it. If he's doing it for those reasons, this is more dangerous than just a lie that's about his ego. Okay.
So you think actually, because where he talked about it most recently was in a session closed to the media consisting of some members of Congress. So do you think convincing some of them this is a real thing is part of the strategy, or do you think it was an intentional leak? That doesn't make so much sense to me. Why do an intentional leak? Why not just say it?
Trump is an authoritarian, so he wants to intimidate the Democrats into confirming his nominees, not doing much to oppose his legislative agenda, but also he wants to. This is armchair psychology, but I think that this is true. He wants to remind them of their powerlessness right now because of their minority status in both houses of Congress. So if he goes in there to the Democrats with this ridiculous lie, it's not just a lie about that helps assuage his fragile ego. It's a lie that's basically saying to them, look, I believe, or at least I'm willing to convince my followers and my supporters that I believe that there's widespread voter fraud. So watch out, because we're going to crack down on it. And there's nothing that you will be able to do about it. Jeff Sessions is going to get confirmed because you guys are in the minority, and we're going to go ahead with it. I think that that's the way he operates. He operates in a way that lets people know what their weakness is, what their, where they will be unable to fight him. And I think that's what that was all about.
So, was part of it almost daring the Democrats present to challenge him on that or something? And, establishing that they hadn't? And, this is something he says, and they keep their mouths shut. Is that kind of part of the idea?
Well, I think that they went to the press. Obviously, every news outlet had the story last night.
Right.
Because, it was obvious that
it was a Democratic leak.
Right. It was a Democratic leak. And I think that was also kind of a sign of their powerlessness. Was there any evidence in the stories that were based on the leak that anyone in the Democratic caucus stood up to him?
That's what I wondered. Why doesn't Chuck Schumer say, excuse me, Mr. President, what is the evidence?
Right. And so I think that in a way, it kind of reinforced their weakness, because it just showed that none of them stood up to him and said a word. And on the actual policy or legislation, that they're kind of powerless to stop him without peeling off some Republicans, which looks unlikely.
I will say, on the crazy versus crazy like a fox position, I've shifted somewhat over the course of the campaign to think he had a strategy. It was somewhat intentionally executed. At the same time, I think he's pretty out of control. And I think to a considerable extent, he has a bizarre character that just happened to suit the moment well, right? The kind of person he is, the insult comic, and that was just perfect, meshed perfectly with the resentment of political correctness, right? The fact that he's the insult, and just with a kind of authoritarian mood in general. I'm the macho guy, and I make fun of everybody who messes with me.
Right.
So I think to some extent, it was, he had been doing that all his life. And so I think to some extent, he just matched the moment. And the reason I think that that's a considerable part of it, and that it's not always masterful tactics you're seeing when he acts bizarrely, is that sometimes it just doesn't make any sense. Like, I don't know if you remember when he was, during the campaign, when he sat down with the editorial board of the Washington Post, and they published the transcript. And he's just from the beginning, he's going off on like, oh, my hotel and blah, blah, blah. And like you and I know journalists, we know what they're thinking. They're thinking, what the hell is going on? We're here to talk policy. This is incredibly self-indulgent. That was not doing him any good. I don't think he sat down with the goal of getting these people to take him less seriously as a candidate. I really don't. And if that was not his goal, what he did there makes no sense. And I think to a kind of scary extent, he just has these reflexes. Always talk about, it's like, even in the CIA address where he said at the end, I don't know if you saw that, he said, oh, and next time we come, he complained about the fact that there are columns in the building. Like, next time we'll get somebody who knows how to build a building or something. It's like, you go there and insult their damn building? I mean, it's like, it's just, there's a lot of weird stuff like this that does not make sense politically.
Well, it did make sense politically for him.
The Washington Post thing?
Yes, because his base hates the media. So the fact that he went to the Washington Post and didn't talk about the wonky things that they wanted to talk about, and instead showed them, what a big, strong man he is and what a great hotel he built. His followers love that.
But see, it wasn't on TV. I don't think his followers read it. You had to want to read the damn transcript. It was strictly for nerds. I mean, it really was. I didn't even know if they knew there was going to be a transcript, but as I recall, there was no coverage. There's nothing that could make the news. And there was nothing newsworthy per se in the transcript. There wasn't a headline in Iowa that said Trump has built a hotel in Washington. It was just like only nerds paid attention to what he said, and everything he said would alienate nerds.
But the point is, he wants to alienate the nerds. He does. That's his entire MO. He
wants to be seen doing that. I grant you. When he's being seen by his constituent, by his base, he wants to be seen doing that. This was not a transparent appearance. Okay,
so if I grant you that only nerds read the transcript of that interview, and I count myself among them, then it fits in with my theory of him that he wants to make people who are in positions, elite positions or nerdy positions, to feel weak, to feel like they're not controlling the agenda. I think that's a big part of his game with the press, because the press, especially the Washington Press Corps, has a lot of conventions and unspoken customs that have just been in place for decades. And he's smashing all of those. And I think there are a lot of people, non-journalists who could care less if he's smashing the conventions of what the White House press corps wants. And for him, from his vantage point, it's like saying, see, you're the elites. You're these Washington insiders who've had these customs and conventions for decades, and I don't have to play by those rules. I can come into this interview with the Washington Post reporters and editorial board, and you guys want to talk about the Iran nuclear deal and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the economy and what have you, and I'm going to talk about my great hotel. It's a big, F you.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
It could be. I mean, even then I might think it's almost more of a habit at this point.
Well,
I think one thing about Trump is, look, he was born, rich. His dad started him off, he went to a not super distinguished prep school where he was probably king of the hill, right? He's the rich kid. He's a big, strong guy who would do well on the playgrounds of junior high and so on, and he's kind of, fearless, not risk averse. So you can imagine, like, he was the king of the hill in prep school, and then he goes on and after college, his dad gives him a $20 million loan, and, you kind of got to work hard to screw up that kind of support, especially when you don't have to actually repay it. It's like being given $20 million.
Right.
And so he kind of, he was put in a position in life where he could have some eccentricities that would have doomed many people early in their careers. You know, certain kinds of crudeness and lack of just everyday respect for people. And because of the kind of business he's in, and you know, real estate is in some ways a rough and tumble business. You're dealing with unions. You're laying down the law, and you know, it ain't Silicon Valley.
Right.
And so in a lot of ways, I just think his, to put it politely, a rough-hewn character has just served him well. And I do think from an early age he had the instincts of a bully, and acting like a bully became kind of a habit that just kept working. And it just kept, and it has never stopped working. And at age 70, you don't lose any habits. So I guess my view is that in a way it's tactical in the sense that it reflects a tactic that has been successful, but I still am not so sure that this is like well thought out on every occasion.
Well, I think that with regard to the press and his instinct to be a bully, when you look at what Spicer and Kellyanne Conway have said over the past couple of days about his relationship with the press, I think everyone has focused on the Conway statement about alternative facts that she made to Chuck Todd on Meet the Press, and Spicer's doubling down on all of these numbers issues with the false claim about the number of people in the crowd at the inaugural, and now the false claim about the voter fraud. But I think what got lost in that shuffle was something that both of them said. And they described the president and the White House's relationship with the press as a two-way street. So they basically said, we'll be nice to you if you're nice to us. And it's a complete subversion of the First Amendment, right? Like, the First Amendment is not contingent on you being nice to the president.
No, but there's always been some of that in the dynamics of journalism.
Yes, particularly in the dynamics of the Washington Press Corps, right? But they were the ones, the Trump administration were the ones who came out of the box with this confrontational attitude.
Yeah.
And then they were like, well, we'll only be nice to you if you're nice to us. And you've been, it's been very demoralizing for the president to see these sparse crowds on TV that came out for his inaugural. And as if whether they're going to be forthcoming with the press is contingent on whether the president feels demoralized by the news or not. I mean, it's a very strange dynamic, and I definitely get the instinct to sort of dislike the conventions of the Washington Press Corps in many ways. And I think that there's a lot wrong with it, starting, like, for example, with the White House Correspondents' Dinner, which famously, I think, possibly touched off Trump's political career. Mm-hmm. But I think that they're trying to recast this relationship as one in which the press must be subservient in certain ways to him in order to get what, the sort of transparency and accountability that the government should just do.
Yeah, you could see Sean Spicer's sequence of interactions with the press, that first day of screaming at them, and then the second day as the classic bully sequence. You beat up on them, and then you're nice to them, and they're grateful. Yeah. They're grateful that you're not. It kind of seemed a little bit. People were pretty damn polite. On the other hand, in today's briefing, when in the wake of this report that he was reviving the claim that several million votes were illegally cast, they were pretty persistent. I mean, they kept coming back to that and kind of hammering him on it. And to me, it's a very open question whether, if he keeps playing it this way and saying things that are pretty widely mocked by the press, including like Morning Joe, right, who can go either way here. He's kind of a barometer, and I think Trump probably watches him. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you saw his reaction to that first Sean Spicer appearance, but he was like, "No more of this, Donald," mm-hmm. And but anyway, I'm not sure. I think it's an open question whether the benefits to Trump of playing to his base by demonizing the media outweigh pretty broad-based blowback. I mean, the media is not what it once was. In terms of the power of mainstream media is not what it was, but it's not nothing.
Right.
And when you
it's
got
not nothing to be called out for a lie on
Right.
the front page of the New York Times.
Right, and people to harp on this thing and say, show us the evidence that several million votes were miscast, illegally cast. You know, we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah.
I do. Speaking of being called out for a lie in the New York Times, this is a little bit of a hobby horse of mine. But you saw, I showed you this tweet of mine that I did this morning, and you know, the New York Times, after he said the thing about the several million votes, New York Times had as a headline, "Trump repeats lie." Now, the word lie was not used in the piece, and the Washington Post didn't use the word lie in the piece or in the headline, which I personally applaud because, as I said in my tweet, my view is, it's kind of an old school journalism view, but a lie, if you look it up, it is, you know, presenting a falsehood with intent to deceive. In other words, part of the definition is that you know it's not true, you don't believe it, but you say it anyway. And
I think that's open to debate.
Well, no, the
right?
standard. I mean, just Google it on. Just go define lie on the internet,
right.
and I'm pretty sure the first definition you'll get. You mean the definition is open to debate?
No, the definition is not open.
Right.
To
Okay.
debate.
So
I'm saying it's open to debate whether he
exactly. That's my point. The New York Times doesn't know that he's lying, and that's why traditionally, until this year, no mainstream newspaper did that with anyone. Mobster testifies, whatever. They don't call it a lie because, first of all, as a strictly technical matter, you never know. There's very rarely compelling evidence that that the person knew it was untrue. And moreover, in this case, it's really an open question. I think Trump's mind is such a weird thing that he could well have convinced himself that these votes were illegally cast. But in any event, my other point is, I think this is like, if the New York Times' goal is to harm him, I think it's a bad strategy. I think using words like lie, turning the front page into an editorial voice, which is what this appears to do, I think, first of all, it plays right into the narrative he's presenting his base. The media hates me. And I just think, in a subtler way, for people who aren't part of his base, it slowly undermines the credibility of the newspaper. They're asserting something in a headline that they don't know is true.
Well, I think that my sense is that the mainstream media is feeling its way right now on how to report this stuff because it's so unprecedented, right? It's like this is something totally new for them to have the President of the United States perpetuate something that's so easily proved false. Okay, so I'm not, it is proved false. Has been.
Well, there's certainly a lack of evidence in this. There's no known evidence to support his claim.
Right. I think. I mean, a lie would be, I wasn't in Milwaukee on October 23rd.
Right.
When he had a rally and that's just a hypothetical. So, yeah, I mean, I get it, but I also sense that the mainstream media is in a place right now where they know they have to do something different. I mean, because he's breaking all the rules, their rules for covering him need to change accordingly, but they're not really sure what that accordingly is. And I don't know, I don't know that it further reinforces his base's hatred of the mainstream media because I don't think it can be reinforced anymore. I mean, this entire summer and fall, I was pretty much completely immersed in the alt-right and in alt-right media and social media and, spending time interviewing and following alt-right figures around. And, they just disregard it. Yes, they may latch on to a New York Times headline for a day or two, but it's not, it's not the heart of what they're saying. And, to them, all of this stuff, I mean, the idea of widespread voter fraud, just like the idea that, that tweet that Trump retweeted, back in 2015 about the black crime statistics that purported to show that most crime is committed by black people. To them, that's just, that's the reality that they've created for themselves and that they live in. And so to them, it's more important to keep advancing it than it is what the New York Times called it. But, and I think that to undermine the credibility of I don't know, like I just feel like they have a sort of limited, the alt-right has a limited reach for undermining the credibility of the New York Times. And, they've maybe tapped out, maxed out on that.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe I'm being optimistic, but I mean, I don't know. Like, I just feel like, hasn't Alex Jones maxed out on his followers?
Yeah, but I think it's broader and subtler than that. Sarah, 3 of my 4 siblings voted for Trump.
Okay.
And so this goes beyond Alex Jones. None of them are crazy, and none of them are even stupid.
Right.
And I've only talked to one of them about it and managed to avoid completely severing the relationship. Mm-hmm. This was the night before the election. I called him and found out he was voting for Trump. But I'm telling you, I think it's a mistake to think of this in binary terms. There's the hardcore, Mm-hmm. My brother doesn't especially like Trump. He just hated Hillary more. And
that, I think, is what drove so many people.
Yeah.
And what's amazing about that was the New York Times was one of the main drivers of the stories about Hillary's emails and the Clinton Foundation and So the New York Times had done a huge favor to Donald Trump.
Oh, don't get me started. The coverage of the Hillary Foundation, the Clinton Foundation, well, don't get me started. But it was like the emails would come out and they'd report them like there's something there, and you'd read the end, go to the piece and go, well, if there's an ethical or legal question being raised by this, could you please tell us what the hell it is? I mean, it was, but I digress. So you don't share my concern.
Well, I will say, I do agree that there's the soft Trump support, right? So you have like his hardcore, base who have the blinders on, right? And then obviously, like, everybody's family has the Trump supporters in it, and like there's some variation, right? Of like the hardcore supporters and the soft supporters who were driven possibly more by hatred for Hillary than affection for Trump. Mm-hmm. And I actually think that there's a lot of people right now who are in that soft area who are open to rethinking things about Trump.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So, I don't know. I mean, like, I do think that the press has to label falsehoods as such. Whether
you can do that. You can do that.
Is a different story.
I mean, interestingly, even if they had called it a falsehood or untruth in the headline, which would have gone a long way toward satisfying me, that would have been a departure from the past. The Washington,
to go straight to the L word was pretty amazing.
Right. I mean, the Washington Post played it the way you traditionally play it. They said Trump repeats without evidence. Yeah. That's the way newspapers have played things. Yeah. So the Times is going way beyond, the tradition. But I will say, there's a lot of things, media can do short of that. One is just stay focused on this issue. Like, when I tweeted about, one thing you see on Twitter every once in a while is, would you quit focusing on inaugural crowd size and his crazy claims about voters and focus on policy? No, it matters if the guy continues to say things that are untrue. That's a legitimate issue, and one thing media can do is just focus on that. Like tomorrow, I'll be interested to see what the New York Times leads with. Sean Spicer kind of made a little bit of, this is why it's interesting, he didn't make a whole lot of news about this one issue, the supposedly invalid votes. But he discussed it, and he said, well, maybe we will study it. And then he said, no, I didn't mean we'll study it. So he didn't really say anything in particular, but it is within the power of the New York Times to make it to the lead story anyway. And I'm fine with him doing that, even though there's no real news. Harp on it. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of things you can do, including investigative reporting and so on. But anyway, so what else is there to say about this guy? Geez, I mean, if the intensity remains what it's been for the first few days, you're going to have to carry me out on a stretcher after 4 years.
Right, I know. I just wonder how this is sustainable for the press. I mean, it's exhausting covering him. How it's sustainable for the public. Are they going to tune out at some point that it's like, oh, this is just more of the same? here, Sean Spicer came out and said something that's based on some conspiracy theory that you'd be more likely to hear on InfoWars. Okay, I get it. He did that yesterday. He'll do it tomorrow. He'll do it next week. And so I wonder if at some point it's just like an overload. People can know, I think that happened a little bit during the campaign. There was a spate of stories about, the David Fahrenthold series on the Trump Foundation, which was excellent, and a series of stories in various places about Trump's finances and his business dealings and the Trump University, and the list goes on and on and on. But I think that it becomes so much that it's hard for people to digest it all. I mean, this is what I do for a living, and I found it hard to keep, it's like, okay, so there was that story about this business transaction and this story about, and it's hard to hold it all in your head. And I have a job where this is what I think about and do all day long. And you try to imagine somebody who has a job where they don't do this all day long, and so they come home and they watch the news at night or they read the newspaper in the morning, and that's all the news that they ingest. And, at some point, does it just become like, okay, I get it, he's a train wreck, but I'm not going to, dwell on it.
No, and the simple thing that failed to break through in all of that coverage of the Clinton and Trump foundations, including all those pieces in the Washington Post, was the Trump Foundation did a number of plainly illegal things.
Yeah.
The Clinton Foundation, I'm not aware of any plainly illegal thing it did. The Trump Foundation did a number of plainly unethical things. With the Clinton Foundation, I'm aware of one thing where that was corrected before it was even publicized, where some guy had gotten on some kind of bullshit committee, but it seemed kind of like pay to play. It was a Clinton Foundation donor, wound up on a bullshit advisory committee, but he was clearly what was wrong with his picture because there were some esteemed people on it. And long before any emails came out, there was an exchange of emails from Clinton underlings, and they said, this looks bad, get rid of this guy. And he was gone. And that's the only thing I'm aware of. That's the clearest thing I'm aware of that raised ethical questions.
Right.
But this basic asymmetry did not come through. No. Right? It was just it's so messy. They both,
Yeah. Yeah, and he's something new, and she's been around Washington. He's going to drain the swamp, and yeah.
Oh, well. So, anything else? I mean, just the last thing, I guess. So, you said you spent a lot of time with alt-right. Do you mean, when I think of alt-right, I actually think of, I don't know if I want to use the word elites, but engaged, relatively well-informed people. I mean, when I think of that movement, I think of these people who are on the internet, and, I don't think of them as the same as being Trump's base, which is in the Midwest, he shows up at an airplane hangar and they come out and cheer.
Right.
Do you mean you hung out with kind of the alt-right in the sense that I'm using the term? These are...
Yeah, the Richard Spencers and et cetera. Yeah.
Okay, so all the way from Spencer to... I don't know what the... Well, that's a good question. What is your definition of alt-right?
Well, it includes white nationalists like Spencer, virulent anti-immigrant activists like Peter Brimelow, white nationalists like Jared Taylor, who puts out and promotes pseudo-scientific research studies that he claims proves that there are IQ differences between the races. It also includes these crazily misogynist men's rights activists and Islamophobes and other people who would fall under that white nationalist, ethno-nationalist, far-right populist umbrella. And it also includes white supremacists like David Duke or some of the other and neo-Nazis like Andrew Anglin, who runs the Daily Stormer website. All of those people consider themselves to be part of the alt-right. And, and the alt-right will embrace, the alt-right leaders will pretty much embrace everyone in that orbit. I don't think that they necessarily embrace somebody like Anglin, but at the same time, they'll have a conference where people will give the, Nazi salute to Spencer when he says, "Hail Trump, hail our people, hail victory." And when I covered that conference in November, I interviewed Holocaust deniers. So it's it's kind of a mix of people who all kind of come together in this opposition to multiculturalism and who believe that white people are under threat in America, by by multiculturalism, by black people being here, by immigrants being here, by Muslims being here. The Jews control the media. It's like a whole range of things like that.
Now, there are people... Well, go ahead.
No.
I was going to say, there are people in the alt-right who are trying to define the term in a way that excludes many of the people you just named. I mean, even months ago...
Yeah, the alt-right calls them alt-lights.
Right, okay. Well, you say the alt-right calls them alt-right, but the alt-right says they're the alt-right, and the people calling them alt-right should be, they clearly don't want to be associated with, like, Spencer. I mean, months ago, I'm sure you saw that. I don't know when this was actually posted. There was a piece on Breitbart by Milo the Horrible, whatever his last name is, and somebody else, co-authored piece about the alt-right. And it was clearly very carefully done in a way that they weren't saying for sure whether they were part of the alt-right, but they were certainly defining the Spencers of the world as really on the extreme, if they were part of it at all, and so on. So that kind of positioning has been going on for a while, but it seems like since the election, there's been a more of an intention among the Milos of the world to just flat out disown the more extreme part of it.
Okay, so when I interviewed Steve Bannon at the Republican convention, so this was before he joined the Trump campaign and obviously before he was in the White House, he told me that Breitbart is the platform for the alt-right. Mm-hmm. That's what he said, the platform for the alt-right. So clearly, around the tenor of the convention, where there were a lot of alt-right people hanging around, that was considered like a boast, right?
Right.
It's just, it's like, my website is the platform for the alt-right. Milo hosted this party at the convention that featured people like Pamela Geller and Geert Wilders from the Netherlands. And it was really, it was pretty much I've covered a lot of weird things in my life, but it was the first time where I felt like, this is kind of like a Nazi rally. Wilders gave this really horrible Islamophobic speech. And the people in the crowd, mostly men, mostly white, youngish men, just started chanting Trump, 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 Trump. And the energy was like so full of, hate. Mm-hmm. And it was, and there were just like a lot of different people milling around there, like these alt-right figures, Milo was there and, Spencer was there and Brimelow was there. And there were just like a lot of people, milling about, and I think this was before they started to have these conflicts about like who is the real alt-right.
Right.
And I think that after that conference, that post-election conference where people were giving the
Heil Hitler
Nazi salutes, right? I think there were some people who were like, we don't want to be associated with that.
Good thinking.
Yeah, but I mean, it's like, Milo had written a piece for Breitbart, months before, where he talked about Spencer being like the intellectual, I can't remember the word he used. There was a noun, he was the intellectual core of the alt-right.
Did he say that?
Oh, yeah.
I wonder if this is a piece I read. I read this piece, I think, before I had a clear idea of who Spencer was.
Right. And
I remember there was some guy they depicted as extreme. Maybe it was the Stormfront guy.
Yeah.
But,
yeah. So, that evening at the NPI conference where the Nazi salutes were given. I mean, it wasn't just that Spencer did that in his speech. Prior to his speech, there was a speech by Kevin MacDonald, which was basically...
I actually met Kevin MacDonald decades ago.
I mean, it was basically the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, right?
Yeah, I met him before any of this. Nobody knew. I mean, he used to show up at these evolutionary psychology conferences.
Oh, really?
He was an actual psychologist who hadn't written any of this stuff.
Uh-huh.
But anyway, I digress. He actually said something interesting that has nothing to do with this. I still remember what he said, but anyway, he that's so weird. I don't know. So where does all this go? I mean, I guess, I think they're going forward. They're going to keep doing what they're trying to do, which is, Bannon has clearly identified himself with the alt-right, so it's essential for him to purge the term of the more extreme, more extreme connotation. So I guess we'll just see this continue.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. We've covered a lot.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there will be more. So keep it up. Keep up the good writing. Any pieces people should look at? Remind us what your Twitter handle is, for example, although this will also be on our site. But
So my Twitter handle is just my name. There are other Sarah Posners in the world, but I got to it first.
Good work. I failed. I didn't do that.
So I've covered the alt-right for Rolling Stone and for Mother Jones. My piece about Bannon, saying that Breitbart's the platform for the alt-right, was in Mother Jones, as was a piece I co-authored with
So
David
that's your
Miller.
piece everyone quotes whenever they say Bannon called it the platform? Really?
Yes.
Excellent work.
And I also co-authored a piece with David Newert about Trump and his how he brought these hate groups into the mainstream over the course of his campaign. That's also in Mother Jones.
Uh-huh.
And then for Rolling Stone, I did 2 pieces on Spencer. One was before the election and one was after.
Okay, well, and we'll continue to look for more stuff, which I'm sure is forthcoming, because there's plenty of grist for your mill.
Definitely.
And maybe after more of it gets milled, you come back and talk to us again.
Anytime.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.